Good morning to everyone watching in Asia, and also thank you to everyone who's staying up late here in the United States to participate in this conversation. We're very excited to be talking about China and the economic crossroads at which Beijing is at. We're hoping that through this discussion, we'll be able not only to delve into the pandemic fallout on the Chinese economy, but also the way to recovery. We're going to be watching the economic reform progress through the lens of the China dashboard, not to mention that we'll also be touching on geopolitical issues, Hong Kong national security law, and how this affects the US-China relationship as well. Thank you all for joining us today. So let's just kick things off. Let me just get started with the news of the week. The IMF saying that China will see economic growth of 1%. And this is sort of the rare bright spot right now when the global economy is forecast to shrink almost 5%. But this, of course, if you take a look at China through the lens of China's past economic growth, when you were growing more than 6% in 2019, then obviously we have seen this huge economic toll from this outbreak. Let me just start things off with Kevin. Let me bring you in for you to give us some context on how this new virus in a relatively unknown city of Wuhan in Hubei province wreaked so much havoc on the Chinese economy.
Well, thank you, Shery, and it's good to be with the Asia Society in Hong Kong and with colleagues, Dan Rosen and Mr. Orlik as well. I think the good citizens of Wuhan would object to the city being called an obscure Chinese town. In fact, throughout Chinese history, as we all know, Wuhan, or Hankou, sometimes it's been referred to in China's past, has been one of the major centers of, let's call it, modern Chinese history, by which I mean 20th century Chinese history. The trajectory of the virus, I think people who are observing this webinar would be well familiar with. We know what happened in December. We know about the failures of the Chinese system centrally and provincially to lock the virus down in the first critical 3 weeks. It then spread throughout the city and throughout the province to other centers within China, and as we know, to the rest of the world. The economic impact of this pandemic, both for China and for the global economy, is unprecedented. We'd have to go back to the history of the Black Death in the 14th century to find something comparable in terms of the destruction of economies, though our 14th century data is less than robust. But the key thing now is, in terms of the interests of our global audience, is how is China now dealing with the virus in terms of its macroeconomic policy settings, and to what extent is the virus itself under control? Let me take the second of those points first. Again, from the international media, we're familiar with the set of spot outbreaks which have occurred in Beijing in the course of the last week to 2 weeks. And these are being taken deadly seriously by the Beijing authorities under Cai Qi, the party secretary responsible for Beijing. And the impact, therefore, on, let's call it, economic activity within the capital will be significant as a consequence of these most recent measures. But it's a salutary reminder as to whether these secondary spot outbreaks, as opposed to a genuine full frontal second wave, can disrupt the trajectory of any economic policy response. That's my first point. On the second, which is China's economic response so far, you referred at the outset to the IMF data. What is interesting for me as someone who sits on the international advisory panel to the IMF managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, is the extent to which the numbers for China, even within the IMF calculus, have progressively gone southwards over the course of the last 3 months. Initially, there was a projection of growth for the 2020 calendar year of 2.6. Now that went down to something just around 2, and now we've got something with a 1 in front of it. My view all along is that China will be very fortunate indeed to escape the year with zero growth. On the policy settings, and I'll conclude on this point because our other speakers will have more to contribute on this. The dilemma for the Chinese government in responding to this is A, the uncertain trajectory of the virus, a common challenge for all governments around the world. B, its ability to simply resort to deficit-funded stimulus, as it did in the global financial crisis, is limited because of the accumulated debt levels from the previous crisis, now running at about 310, 320% of GDP. And thirdly, classical stimulus, even when applied, still has only partial effect when people are still frightened to resume normal, as it were, social and economic activity, particularly in the services sector. So the dilemma in China at present is what sort of stimulus, given those constraints, works to bring the economy back to something approaching normality? And secondly, and critical to the work which we at the Asia Policy Institute and Dan Rosen have been doing for the last 4 years together, is whether this is therefore signaling a rebirth of a third wave of market economic reform in order to unleash the animal spirits in the Chinese private sector. But I'm sure we'll get to that more in our substantive conversation.
We'll definitely want to hear about that potential reforms coming China's way, perhaps crises promoting that reform that you mentioned. But let's focus right now a little bit on one of the points that you mentioned, that perhaps the policy restrictions and limitations given the reality of the Chinese economy. Tom, let me turn to you because, of course, you just published the book, China, the Bubble That Never Pops. And it's one of your points that we have been waiting for the imminent doom of the Chinese economy, given those limitations that Kevin just mentioned. So where are we at right now, post-COVID or during the COVID pandemic?
Well, thanks very much, Shery. And let me first of all say thank you very much to the Asia Society for inviting me, and also say that I'm very honored to be on a panel with Kevin and Dan. I can't think of anyone who's engaged at such a senior level with the Chinese leadership as Kevin, and I personally always feel very lucky to have the chance to hear his remarks and benefit from his expertise. And I can't think of anyone who's engaged so comprehensively and so insightfully as Dan Rosen across the suite of Chinese economic policy issues. So I always read his work with a great deal of attention as well. So coming to your question, so I lived in China for 11 years, from 2007 to 2018. And for that entire period, there was a strain of pessimism, even of doom, running through the Western commentary on China's economy. Yes, the story went, 10% growth looks very impressive, but poke beneath the surface and what you find is a bubble. A debt bubble. And at some point, that bubble is going to burst. And so the motivation for my book, China, the Bubble That Never Pops, was to explore, well, how big is the stress? And why does that stress never actually seem to result in the crisis which everyone's worried about? And the COVID-19 shock is really, of course, primarily a human tragedy, but it's also an extreme stress test for China's economy and China's financial system. The biggest borrowers in China's economy, the state-owned enterprises, the local governments, the real estate developers, they've all seen their income completely collapse in the first half of this year. And when their income collapses, that means they don't have money to repay their borrowing. So if there was a moment when China would see a financial crisis, presumably it would be now. And yet, China's banks remain stable, China's markets remain stable. As Kevin mentioned, China is going to have very weak growth this year, but relative to the rest of the world, China is actually going to do rather well. So there's been this extreme stress test. China has come through it. And I think what that suggests is that the pessimistic lens through which we view China's economy and China's financial system is actually missing some important drivers of strength and resilience.
Dan, let's turn to you and talk a little bit about the points that were mentioned right now, whether it's the huge arch villain in China's economy, which is the level of its debt, but also at the same time, during the pandemic, we really haven't seen those aggressive policy strategies that we've seen in the past when Beijing had to deal with past crises. So where are we at right now, Dan?
Such great discussion already. In order for China not to collapse last time around, after 2008, China had to permit its banking system to quadruple in size over the past decade, to the point where the ratio of debt service every year is about double annual growth of the economy. A decade ago, the last time that they went to that playbook, the value of debt service was just a fraction of annual growth in the system. So what Tom observed, and what a few of us did in those years, that if China really wanted to, it could use this debt strategy to keep delivering stability for a good while longer than some of the more skeptical folks thought. That was quite correct. It's not correct now. You can no longer do that when already just paying the interest on your debt is double the annual growth of your economy. And soon it'll be triple and then quadruple, because growth will be at 1%. So the debt service will still be there, but there's going to be, as Kevin said, really lucky if there's zero GDP growth this year. So it's just a untenable situation going forward. China's advantage at a time like this is that the government has got somebody in everybody's living room, let's say, and if they want to step in and brace up everything and tell everyone that they're going to keep everything stable for the time being, they can do that, and they are doing that. The problem is that when you do things that way, it's the most inefficient way you could possibly run an economy. And so debt is already out there. It's huge, huge value. It needs to be paid off in order for people's retirements to be funded, their needs in the future to be taken care of. And there is, not only is there no growth for right now, but when everything is being determined by kind of a command and control edict from a political commissar, there's not going to be any growth or efficiency in the future. And another byproduct of the way China is doing things presently is that it needs to de-link and deconnect its markets to a great extent from whatever disciplines of market activity are out there in the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world is also going to the government playbook in a counter-cyclical way in a crisis. It's one thing if that's temporary, but that's not going to be temporary in China, because they're going to have to keep these extraordinary interventions in place more or less indefinitely now. And it's not going to be possible for them to stay on course with the kind of financial opening to the world, for example, which is on their timetable, what's supposed to be happening right here and now.
Let me turn back to Kevin, because you mentioned consumption and fundamental parts of the economy that perhaps have taken a bigger hit right now because of the coronavirus pandemic. Kevin, when you take a look at the Chinese economy, we continue to see factories starting to run, but people really not coming back to spend. How dangerous is that situation when the recovery is uneven?
Well, you simply have to do the mathematics in terms of the relevant significance now of domestic consumption to China's overall GDP. And we know that this has been a deliberate and core element of Chinese economic strategy for about a decade now, which is to turn China into an economy whose principal driver of growth is no longer low wage manufacturing for export, no longer classically export driven as in the history of the newly industrialized economies of East Asia, but to move to a different plane for which there are new drivers. One, principally domestic consumption. Two, of course, innovation-driven investment. So purely in terms of the macroeconomic numbers, if you've got a significant contraction in consumption, it's going to flow through in a big way into the overall growth and employment numbers. Secondly, remember that consumption is particularly intensive in, let's call it, the services sector. And if you just drill down into the services sector alone, whether it's education, whether it's training, whether it's tourism, whether it's hospitality, all of these are people-intensive areas of employment, but also because they are people-intensive, they are at the sharp edge of the COVID impact because of social distancing protocols and in some cases norms and regulations. So this remains not just a downward driver on growth recovery across the global economy, where consumption levels are significant in overall GDP, but it is particularly significant also for China itself. But having made those remarks, if I could just pivot slightly from what I've just said and to an earlier, I think, fascinating comment from Tom about what we're missing in our analysis of China. I think his analysis, his observation that China, like all of us, have faced a comprehensive economic and financial stress test through this COVID-induced recession. And given the constraints which now have been delivered to this generation of Chinese leaders because of the debt overhang from the last crisis, I'd be interested to hear from Tom what he sees to be the things that we are missing because the bubble has not yet popped or burst.
Tom?
So I'm just going to clarify my use of the pronoun we. I'm not including China experts Kevin Rudd and Dan Rosen in the pronoun we. I'm going to include myself. I'm going to include lots of other people. I'm not going to include Kevin and Dan. They're sharp people. There's not a lot of stuff that they miss. But when I think about the sort of the bear narrative on China, the people who have said over the last decade, China's on a treadmill to hell. China can't get off this heroin of debt. People who focused on the ghost towns, people who focused on the industrial overcapacity. I think there's a couple of things which have been missing from that narrative. So the first thing is financial crises do not start on the asset side of banks' balance sheets. Financial crises start on the liability side of banks' balance sheets. Banks don't fall over because they have bad loans. Banks fall over because they have no funding. And in China, because the savings rate is so high and because the capital account is controlled, there's a continued buildup of deposits in the banking system. And what that means is that the trigger for crisis never comes. The funding for the banks never dries up. The second thing I think that we, again, not including Dan and Kevin, miss is the capacity of China's policymakers to move the dial on the macro aggregates in a meaningful way. So the example which always comes to my mind is the example of ghost towns. So when I was in China, I spent a number of years, a lot of time, I spilt a lot of ink warning people about the problem of overcapacity in China's real estate sector. And that problem was real. What didn't occur to me was that China's policymakers could engage in a multi-year program of what's kind of euphemistically called slum clearance, where they would forcibly relocate millions of people from their old low-rise homes into the empty new skyscrapers on the edge of the town. And when you can move policy in that way, of course, at massive social cost, then some macro problems that appear insuperable suddenly start to appear a little bit more manageable, at least on a short-term, medium-term time horizon.
I think you made that point in your book, right? That you don't really go into financial crisis and meltdown because of bad loans, but it's because you run out of funding, like you did during the Asian financial crisis when South Korea lost all the foreign funds. But let me ask you a little bit about what happened in 2019 when you had Baoshan Bank in China for the first time seeing a default in a Chinese bank in about 20 years, and turned this conversation into economic reforms, because we, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, and I guess we'll go into more depth because we'll be analyzing the China dashboard, what it means and how far we've come even before the COVID-19 pandemic, and where do economic reforms go from here. Dan, let me turn to you because we do have the ASPI and Rhodium Group China dashboard. Where are we at? Because your latest data was on the set of numbers before the pandemic started.
Yeah, the dashboard has two elements, remember. There's the trove of time series data up to the most recent available quarter. And then there's the policy discussion and interpretation of it that goes along with that in the text. So it offers those two things. And the data took us right up to the eve of the pandemic, to January 1st, 2020. And then we had a chance, given the timing, to discuss a little bit what was happening with all these policy clusters that we look at in the midst of the acute phase of the crisis for China. What the data told us was, even before COVID struck, conditions for the labor force of the country, right? Which one of the things people have observed over the past month is, they're really emphasizing employment now. They've gotten rid of the GDP target and replaced it with all this high hope language about focusing on employment as the principal, weather vane for good policy making. But even pre-COVID, back fourth quarter of last year, wage growth for urban workers and migrant workers was so far in percentage terms below nominal GDP growth, which is how we look at that to kind of see whether things are going okay for workers relative to the overall state of affairs. And then, of course, it just got much, much worse. It remains very, very bad. Even if we get to a couple percent GDP growth for the nation this year, it's going to mostly be infrastructure and property activity, which don't necessarily soak up all those workers. In terms of the efficiency of what the banks do, the tragedy that Tom speaks to, that the bubble never pops, is that it keeps getting bigger and bigger. And the bigger it gets, by definition, right, the lower the marginal return on investment is going to be. If you have by far the world's largest money supply already at $30 trillion worth of assets in the system. So bubbles popping, that's the solution to the inefficiency problem. And the fact that it hasn't popped is why our dashboard indicator for financial efficiency, what we call the incremental capital output ratio, was at an all-time record bad as of December 2019, before they even canceled any effort to delever and to deal with the local government finance vehicles and let them basically back off the leash because they had no better idea for how to stoke at least a little bit of growth to counter the narrative that this time would be different, and that something, not just Baoshan, but we've had 5 other banks fail or go into receivership for the first time since the 1990s, since Baoshan, right?
Kevin, would you like to add to this?
I think it's a fascinating discussion because we're all trying to wrestle this one to the ground. I mean, like Tom, I've never subscribed to the China collapse thesis, either from a political science perspective or from the debt implosion perspective, which have been the two principal drivers of this thesis over the last decade or so. Neither analysis actually grounds itself in a full appreciation of the powers of a Marxist-Leninist state. But what Dan is legitimately pointing to is a new set of constraints which have been not just accumulating, but snowballing over the last decade since the global financial crisis. And so I think where it's profitable to take this conversation is the debt bubble is getting bigger. We know that. And there have been recent further relaxations of the, let's call it, debt discipline procedures put in by Liu He over the last several years. They've now been released again. To which Tom's counterpoint is, yeah, but it's China, and two things are happening. Being a great Confucian society, there are still high levels of savings despite growing levels of consumption. And second, they don't liberalize the current account, and they're not likely to. So I think the essential question we need to come to terms with here is, given the objective data that the debt bubble gets bigger, open brackets, when it bursts, it won't just be a pop, it'll be an explosion. That's the underlying element of that thesis. But secondly, what Tom's saying is, yeah, but in a realistic sense, given the two huge factors, as it were, shaping the capacity to service debt, which is actually national savings, directly or indirectly, and the lack of, shall we say, the classic international correctives which come into play when global financial markets mark down your currency because your debt servicing ratio is too high. Hence why the Chinese have not liberalized their current account, capital account. So therefore, given those realities, how do we best put an analytical handle around China's, as it were, financial sustainability and therefore its economic stability? I'd like to hear both Tom and Dan on that one. Then I wouldn't mind coming back on where the economic reform issue lies more broadly in the Chinese economy. But I think this core question about debt sustainability, we really need to wrestle further to the ground.
Tom, you want to take it first?
Sure. There's a couple of points that I would make. So the first is, in 2016, Liu He launched a deleveraging campaign in China. And I think this was in itself remarkable. There are many countries in the world that have had an explosion of debt and where that debt has triggered a crisis. There are not many countries who have paused on the cusp or before the crisis and said, no, enough, we have to stop. Let's think about the United States in 2006 and 2007. Were the top economic policymakers warning on the risks in the mortgage-backed security system? No, they weren't. And that failure to grasp the nettle was one of the reasons why the crisis blew up. So I think the fact that China moved early is itself remarkable and a reason for stability. The second point I would make is that China has attempted something which I think is quite important, which is to have counter-cyclical financial regulation. And the idea here is that financial regulation should behave in the same way as monetary policy and fiscal policy. In the good times, you should tighten up. And because you tighten up in the good times, in the bad times, you're able to open the spigots a bit, allow a bit more lending, and hopefully get the economy through the bad times because you've built in that margin for leveraging up again. So yes, it's completely correct that in 2020, China will see loan growth accelerating again, and we're already seeing that taking place. And who knows, maybe this will be the beginning of another 2008 style splurge and they'll move on to an unsustainable trajectory. But for now, I'm giving them credit for keeping within that counter-cyclical framework. They tightened up a lot in 2016, 17, 18, 19. Now, because of the COVID shock, they need to do a bit more. They need a bigger fiscal stimulus. They need more lending. They need a more relaxed approach to financial regulation to get them through this slump. We'll see. If the Liu He framework stays in place, then once they're through the slump, they'll get back on track with the deleveraging process.
Much needed. 260% of GDP, the debt level right now. Dan?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on this. The good news is that when Beijing decides it wants to try to effect reform, whatever that is going to mean to them, they have the ability to impose it more. It's in some ways going to be easier than it is in a market economy where there's more due process and all sorts of constraints on them. And indeed, they did manage to make the case to themselves. They needed to do that in 2016, 2017, after a series of miniature crises had already taken place, I would say, though. But here's the rub, that you can try to clean things up and get yourself on a more sustainable path that doesn't present such a severe risk of an implosion-sized, bubble deflation. But you can't do that and have stability at the same time. And that is, I think, what Beijing hasn't reconciled yet. It knows it needs to do this reform, and at times has very ardently and sincerely started that reform process. But inevitably, those reforms reveal that there's going to be a much more painful, nasty period of instability and risk than the political leadership is willing to underwrite and guarantee that the party's going to be comfortable with. And hence, partway through these reform cycles, they've fallen back from it and tried to stop halfway and hope that tomorrow would be a little bit easier. So they've also, and then they've also, as in 2016, 2017, obscured the reality of just how much instability and slowdown there was. Growth did not hold tight at around 6 to 6.5% in those years. It fell by, when Chinese friends are being frank with Tom and I, they'll say, well, maybe it was 2.5% at the bottom of that cycle, right? Catastrophically low according to the standard narrative, but we're not permitted to have a clean look at what those realities are too often.
So then, do I take it then that you're a bit more skeptical when it comes to, let's turn our attention to the National People's Congress and the May Comprehensive Reform Decree, what's being called the Guidance on Speeding Up the Improvement of the Socialist Market Economic System in the New Era, which is sort of what was supposed to be a new guideline of reform, similar to perhaps what we saw back in 2013. Dan, do I take it that you're a little bit more skeptical about whether or not this will happen?
More than similar, we did a word cloud of the text of the May 18th guidance compared to the 60 decisions of the third plenum in 2013. And it was, well, let's just say it had about as much DNA in common as humans and Neanderthals, which means like 99%. So the good news is that it was as good a reform manifesto.
Does that mean close or not close, by the way?
Some more than others. That it was as good a manifesto as 2013. The bad news is that it was almost the exact same manifesto as 2013, which acknowledges that all that stuff that Xi Jinping said then, if we don't get this done by 2020, we're going to be in a blind alley, a dead end. We're going to be in deep, deep trouble, has essentially been revealed not to have been gotten done, any of that stuff. And so now we have the same prescription again. We don't have any good companion explanation for why this time is going to be any different in terms of implementing that reform.
Kevin, I want to believe that you're a little bit more optimistic about where we're headed here.
Well, belief is an interesting question, Shery. So, I'm just an old-fashioned empiricist. I look at the data.
What does it tell you? Should we trust China that they will be able to implement the reforms that they couldn't since 2013 to 2020?
Well, let me try and mesh together where we've got in our conversation so far. We had a good discussion about, let's call it, the presence or absence or relative absence of, let's call it, the debt overhang from the global financial crisis as a constraint on China's policy options today. Secondly, when we go to the detail of China's policy options today, in bold, broad, stark terms, they are A, stimulate more, and then there's a sub-debate about using what levers of stimulus, or B, return to the 2013 playbook and realize, as I said, I think in my initial remarks, that it's time to unleash the animal spirits of the Chinese private sector. Now, on the latter, which is the on again, off again, on again, off again, on again, Chinese economic reform blueprint since 2013, it makes for a fascinating study. And it goes to the absolute heart of the political economy of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think it's important for us to understand that in the period from 2013 to 2015, Xi Jinping's worldview was along these lines. A, head left on the party, that is, tighter party control of dissent, a vigorous anti-corruption campaign, and a maximization of party political discipline, and hence the expulsion of various opponents of Xi Jinping, and effectively a party rectification campaign to restore ideology to the core of the party's heart and soul, rather than being seen as marginal to reforming China's concerns. Then there was a come to Jesus, or what I'll describe now as a come to Marx moment in 2015. It's called the Chinese financial crisis of August of that year. And if we look carefully at the politics of that, there was what I'd describe in Australian political science terms as one giant WTF moment in Zhongnanhai and the Chinese leadership, and particularly in the Xiban, the Xi Jinping office, saying, is this what the next generation of reform is going to deliver us? Financial markets totally out of control, and with all the real consequences of potential financial collapse and the economic growth fallout which follows. And what I have tracked in my own research is that from about that time, you start to see a significant U-turn in China's economic policy settings. There is no more references in the public declaratory language much to the new economic model proudly proclaimed in 2013, let alone its 60 reform measures, the 新的经济模式. Instead, what we had by the end of 2015 was a new, let's call it economic nostrum, supply-side structural reform. Now, it sounds terrific, supply-side structural reform. It sounds terribly technical, terribly reformist. But if you deconstruct what supply-side structural reform actually is within the nuts and bolts of the Chinese economy, by and large, as articulated through the party's central documents, it's basically a collectivity of industry policies which enhance state and party intervention in the economy. And so from the end of 15 through 16, through 17, through 18, through 19, whereas economic policy in the first 2 years of Xi Jinping's administration, from 13 to 15, had essentially either turned right, that is pro-market. From the period of 15 to 19, it began decisively to turn left. And as a consequence of that, you then begin to see the Chinese private sector, as Dan Rosen has just pointed out, as it were, walk with its, or vote with its feet. That is, we began to see collapsing levels of Chinese private fixed capital investment. And of course, all that happened at a time when the Liu He debt consolidation strategy was happening as well. So with debt consolidation happening at one level, which was, painful for the Chinese private sector, on the other hand, the Chinese private sector was not being given new levels of policy room to operate in the economy. And you had instead had party committees having greater roles within firms. You had caps being put on the growth levels of large Chinese private sector enterprises, and other perceived and some real constraints on their future growth and profitability. And that brings us to the present, which is our second, let's call it come to Jesus moment, which has come back to Adam Smith moment, given we've had a come to Marx moment on the economy for the last 4 years. We're given this devil's own alternative between more debt on the one hand to re-stimulate the economy and what is a god-awful crisis by post-cultural revolution standards, or open the spigots, but this time the policy spigots of market-based economic reform, for which the centre ground is competition policy reform, which means opening up what the private sector can do and submitting the SOEs finally to real market disciplines and competitive neutrality. That is where they've got to intellectually. But as Dan and ourselves put in the most recent China Economic Dashboard, the jury is well and truly out as to whether this is simply a declaratory statement for markets or whether it be operationalized in a manner which didn't happen post-13.
Now, moving the conversation forward, I do wonder if what we're seeing with the new national security law for Hong Kong, in fact, undermines any reform signal that we might be getting from China on paper. Kevin?
I think knowing the Chinese system reasonably well, our Chinese friends genuinely see these things in two different boxes. I mean, let's put this into comparative economic terms. Hong Kong is a small and decreasingly significant proportion of China's overall economic activity. Its central significance is twofold. One, it's the ability for Chinese firms to raise global capital through Hong Kong-based financial institutions or the Hong Kong stock market. And B, China's second level concern is about global, as it were, reputational risk from what happens in Hong Kong. But I do not believe that the decision-making machinery in Beijing, looking at the future trajectory of the Chinese economy and what is a fundamental challenge, and let me say small c crisis for the Chinese leadership, which is to restore growth and to sustain employment now, I do not believe that is being considered in an integrated fashion with the Hong Kong National Security Law. The Hong Kong National Security Law is being prosecuted for Beijing's own, as it were, national security and foreign policy imperatives, and a decision to double down nationalistically across a range of questions, whether it's in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, East China Sea, or even the Sino-Indian border.
Tom, what's the future for Hong Kong as a financial hub when we have, Kevin mentioned the stock exchange in Hong Kong and trying to raise money from overseas, but at the same time, you have other mainland stock exchanges that have been promoted, like the New Star Market or even the proposed yuan-denominated Macau bourse?
I think it's a critically important question, Shery. I think clearly the protests, the dissent which have taken place in Hong Kong over the last few years have crossed a red line for Beijing, not a part of the world which has a sort of very tolerant attitude for dissent or protest. And I think clearly also, as Kevin said, the significance of Hong Kong for the broader Chinese economy has changed and in many ways diminished. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, Hong Kong played an absolutely critical role as a trade and financial staging post. The money to privatize China's banking system, the expertise to privatize China's state-owned enterprises back when Hank Paulson was going into Zhongnanhai to meet with Zhu Rongji was all coming through Hong Kong. And now that's just not the case. Chinese firms are raising money on domestic exchanges. They're raising money on exchanges around the world. Yes, they're raising money in Hong Kong too, but it doesn't have that absolutely critical critical place in the Chinese story. An additional factor, of course, is that China's domestic system is also opening up. Now, I spoke at the beginning about how a closed capital account was a critical foundation of China's financial stability, and that's true. But in characteristic fashion, China's policymakers are attempting to enjoy some of the benefits of increased openness whilst avoiding some of the extreme costs. So what we're seeing now is some of the biggest investment houses in the world do have direct access to the market in Shanghai and Shenzhen. And that too means that Hong Kong has this different and in some respects less central role to what it did 10, 20 years ago.
Dan?
Oh, it's I'm seeing Hong Kong at present alongside a bunch of other choices as well. A number of things have come up, and we haven't really talked about the international dimension very much until now, and we're talking about Hong Kong, which is sort of not entirely international even. But when faced with this choice between whether to emphasize long-term efficiency and respect for private sector interests on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to shore up and tighten up increasingly hard to protect security imperatives from the party's perspective over and over again in recent months, while we have had this good return or rekindling of talk about reform, but in terms of how the Hong Kong security law is being rolled out, it's as if there was no consideration whatsoever for how to do this in a way that would not be threatening to Hong Kong's economic well-being in the future. Just 2 days ago, we had the State Council release an additional set of guidance on converting from export orientation to domestic consumption for national manufacturers, as though they were already anticipating that the the world economy is going to become less accessible for China, and so they're going to have to find more and more sources of growth and momentum at home. So when I see how things in Hong Kong are being handled, it just seems to be part of a pattern of overemphasizing security and underemphasizing the importance of efficiency that would be measured the same way in China as it would be in Israel or France or the United States or Australia or Korea or anywhere else. At the end of the day, the laws of nature are still the laws of nature, and efficiency, whether the resources you put in to an economy produce more on the way out than is required to do something in the first place, that's universal, and that should be objective.
We'll be turning to audience questions very shortly, but I do want to get your brief takes on where the U.S.-China relationship is headed. We know that the Hong Kong security law in itself has added to the tensions already existing in these ties, including whether or not the trade deal, the phase one trade deal, is either fully intact or over. We've had that debate this week, just roiling the markets as well. Kevin, just give us an outlook of post-COVID-19. What will the U.S.-China relationship look like?
So long as you tell me, Shery, when post-COVID starts, I'll be very happy to answer your question.
I think it'll be another year or so.
Well, let's put COVID to one side and just look at the structural dimensions of the US-China relationship. And with all of our discussions on the Chinese economy and its future direction, it does fall within the overall framework within China's decision-making matrix of China's power in the region and the world. It's just that within that calculus, the Hong Kong question within their hierarchy of needs is relatively small. The US-China relationship, however, by contrast, is fundamental. That's because the Chinese system ultimately respects power. Therefore, in any analysis of comprehensive national power undertaken in Zhongnanhai, 综合国力, comprehensive power, is a rolling calculus that the Chinese make in terms of where they stand vis-a-vis the United States, and in certain calculations together with its friends, partners, and allies in Asia, and frankly, globally. And so what underpins all this, and we cannot walk away from this reality, is the changing nature and content of the power equilibrium or the power balance between China and the United States over a long period of time. And that's been narrowing militarily. It's been certainly in conventional military within, let's call it, the West Pacific. It's certainly been narrowing in terms of foreign policy influence. And it's certainly been narrowing in terms of, let's call it, the standard measures of economic power and capability. So what's happened underpinning all this, and we can become focused on an event or an issue, is that this is what's driving the shift. And post-17, whether we like Donald Trump or loathe Donald Trump, and I tend to be in the latter category, is the reality is that he has reflected, as it were, an inflection point in the American body politic to double down in response to this increasing levels of assertion of Chinese power in various domains across the world: economic, military, technological, human rights, etc. So that is going to continue. So the key question is, can this increasing structural tension between these two great powers be managed in a stable way in the future, or will it spiral out of control? What I find most fascinating in this context is the decision by Yang Jiechi and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to meet in Hawaii less than a week ago, in the midst of what seemed to me to be a bit of a US-China spiral. I have no hard information to base this on, but I have a view that from China's perspective at least, and possibly many in Washington, began to wish to assert and insert some correctives, some, as it were, parameters within which this spiral could be managed. And that part of those parameters was, let's not trigger ourselves into an accidental war in the Taiwan Straits.
Perfect timing to turn to our audience question. Let me start with you, Dan. Is America or China better positioned to withstand the trade war and COVID-19 economic damage? Why?
Oh, okay. That makes it easy. Who's better positioned to withstand the trade war? I mean, the answer to that is the country that has less of a trade surplus with the world. I think more of China's GDP growth, its interests are tied up with its role as the workshop to the world than any other country on the planet right now. And so if it comes down to trade, the U.S. is going to be able to hang in there longer than China. I think that insight probably was seen by the national security team in Washington, even at the beginning of the Trump era. They came to the conclusion that they could take chances and risks around trade to a greater extent than China could. And we have stress tested that already as well, haven't we?
COVID-19 economic damage seems to be a bit different right now.
We have a good sense of the damage on the U.S. side. We don't have as clear a sense of what the full butcher's bill, the damage is on the Chinese side for a variety of reasons to do with data access and availability, I think. It's almost, I think it's, both the United States and China are suffering just immeasurable damage from this disease. And they could have alleviated at least some of that pain had they been better prepared to work together, right? So, the question to where are we going to be in the long run? Well, even if we decide that we're economically not engageable anymore because our interests are just too systemically different in terms of how our systems are going to work, right? We still need to find our way back to dealing with all these transnational issues and whatnot, right? And I think when the full bill is due for the damage done here, it's going to be obvious to us.
Takes us to our next viewer's question. Decoupling was becoming the mainstream narrative about U.S.-China relations even before COVID-19. Tom, has COVID-19 substantively reinforced or reversed the factors driving that trend?
So the trade war was already a factor driving, the trade war already reflected a degree of decoupling. COVID-19 threatens to accelerate that process. A question I have in my mind is, what will the US-China relationship look like if we get to January 2021 and we have a different face in the White House? How much of the current stress in US-China relationship is a reflection of the personality of Donald Trump, and how much of it reflects something which is more structural, something which is more societal. Unfortunately, I think that there is actually something structural and something societal taking place. I think that American society has now shifted to see China less as an opportunity, more as a threat. And so I suspect that there's going to be some commonalities if we have a Biden presidency. One way to think about this is in terms of the intersection between strategic orientation, the strategic orientation the US has towards China, and the tactics which the US uses to achieve its strategic objectives. So I suspect that if in 2021 we have a Biden presidency, the strategic orientation, the new sense that China is a threat that has to be managed, is going to stay broadly similar. Maybe it's going to stay broadly similar. Maybe there'll be some softening, but that broad orientation will remain the same. What I do think is going to change is the tactics. I'll be charitable here and characterize the tactics of the Trump administration as unpredictable. difficult to get your head around. And I think that in itself, because of the uncertainty it's created, is actually one of the problems for businesses, for investors, for other countries trying to orient themselves. I suspect that if we move towards in a Biden presidency, even if the strategy, even if the strategic orientation was broadly similar, the tactics would be more procedurally thorough, more transparent, generate less churn, less turmoil, less uncertainty for the rest of the world.
I know that Dan wanted to add something, but it just reminded me of this really interesting piece earlier this week from Bloomberg, interviewing former and current officials in the Chinese administration, that they actually wanted Trump to stay in power for 4 more years because that could potentially benefit Beijing, because Trump is destroying the network of alliances that could perhaps have helped America deal with China, despite the fact that everybody thinks that perhaps relations will sour from here. Dan, I think you wanted to add to something that Tom had to say.
Just a very small coda on Tom's important point. I think there's no better support for the observation that the shift in American thinking toward China is structural and more or less permanent than to observe that that shift is not just American, but is visible across the European Union, even in the United Kingdom, which had decided that it was going to play its China cards differently than the continent. Obviously, in Australia, there's been an extraordinary turn of mind. Canada, Japan, and on and on and on. It's virtually a universal OECD, advanced economy phenomena right now, that people are changing their basic assumptions about how much they can engage with a nation, a $16 trillion economy and growing, that intends to apply industrial policy to make virtually all decisions, not just a few.
Kevin, I want your thoughts, and I'm going to add the angle of the technological competition as well. One of our viewers asking about 5G supremacy and bringing this into the US-China relationship as well.
Yeah, well, in many respects, the Huawei 5G debate over the last year or two is a snapshot of the wider debate on technological decoupling, the wider debate on decoupling in period, and the wider debate on, let's call it, what Dan was just referring to as a more comprehensive OECD reaction to industry policy writ large. And by industry policy, we basically mean massive government intervention in the economy. So if you go back to the Huawei example, and leaving aside the whole question of which piece of technology is most effective in the marketplace in terms of what Huawei has to offer, technology and infrastructure, I should say, what Huawei has to offer, as opposed to what Nokia and Ericsson have to offer. The bottom line is the United States has made its strategic decision. The Australian government has made its strategic decision. So has Japan made its strategic decision against Huawei, although in a marvelous reflection of the kabuki theatre of Japanese foreign policy politics, it's not been declared as such. And you start to see this decision now going to the absolute centre of chancelleries across Europe as well. So I believe that what we're going to see on balance is a cleavage when it comes to 5G technologies around the world. You already see that in terms of some of the statements from the US administration in support of Nokia and Ericsson. You see that also in terms of what some of the European governments are doing on this question. And more broadly, where this goes to is the next stage decoupling as far as, let's call it, semiconductors are concerned. This, I think, is fundamental to, frankly, China's own industry policy-driven initiative encapsulated in the Made in China 2025 strategy released in 2015. And if it does not have access to global semiconductor supplies, given that semiconductors are fundamental to most of the other technology platforms where China seeks to globally lead, what does China then do? Can China simply make all this work through its own indigenous policy? Well, it's been trying to do that in computer chips and semiconductors for a long period of time, but it continues to lag significantly. The principal Californian suppliers, the South Korean suppliers, Samsung, as well as those in Taiwan. Or where else does China go? Does it seek to use geopolitics to deal with its problem of vulnerability in its technology as far as its relationship with Taiwan and South Korea are concerned? Unlikelihood of success. But broadly, if you're looking at this from a tech perspective alone, the paths are heading in this direction. And for fundamental economic policy setting reasons and the geopolitics underpinning that, I do not see that divergence narrowing.
Taking the technological conversation a little bit farther, especially in Beijing trying to achieve the supremacy on that space. Tom, viewer question, China's new digital currency, will this have an impact on economic reforms? And whether China can play a leading role in global cryptocurrencies?
That's actually a surprisingly common question. A number of people have asked me that recently, and so you would think that I would have developed a really smart, snappy answer, but I haven't. So a few thoughts. The first is that China has already tried to make the yuan an international currency, an international trade settlement currency, an international financial currency, and they've made some important progress. Bloomberg has been central to the creation of a yuan trading hub in New York. But I think it's also fair to say that progress has been fairly slow. It's been fairly slow, and one of the important reasons for that is that there are still controls on capital flows in and out of China. The second thing I would say is that there is a high degree of skepticism about cryptocurrencies. There was a cryptocurrency bubble in the last few years, which expanded and then exploded, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. The third thing I would say is that one of the concerns which many people around the world have is the rise of China's surveillance capacity, right? China's capacity to watch what everyone else is doing and absorb that information into a kind of panopticon in Beijing. And of course, cryptocurrencies are a powerful tool for collecting information on what everyone's doing. If you can see where the money is going, you can see where all of the financial and economic relationships are. So if you put all of those things together, China's progress, but limited progress on expanding the role of the yuan, skepticism about the role of cryptocurrencies themselves, and concern about the potential for surveillance, I'd be skeptical about a very, very significant global role for a Chinese digital currency. What I would say, though, is that within China, there's been an explosion in growth in e-payments. If you go to China now and you try and pay for something in cash, well, good luck. If you're not using WeChat or Alipay, it's going to be difficult for you to buy anything from a taxi ride all the way up to, a Louis Vuitton handbag. It's all electronic payments. And that, I think, is actually an important counterpoint to the concern about the stall in China's reform of the state sector. Because the fact that e-payments are now so prevalent actually is an important new instrument which China's policymakers have. Because e-payment means that China's policymakers can collect, China's banks, China's tech companies have an ocean of information about consumer preferences, about business balance sheets. And that information is powerful. And over time, it could potentially be a powerful driver of greater efficiency in China's financial system and China's economy.
In fact, many analysts that I talk to say the reason that Alibaba is so strong and does so well is not necessarily because of the sales themselves, is because they know how to use artificial intelligence to gather all of that data on their consumers. Dan, you wanted to add something to what Tom was saying.
Yeah, the financial technologies we're talking about here, including a digital currency, These are what in economics we call potentially disruptive technologies, right? And they're so exciting to investors and the business sector, because if you're the first mover of a winning new technology, you will use it to kill and destroy your competition and take their money away from them, take their market share away from them. It is we sometimes talk about Schumpeterian destruction also in academic circles. The way that efficient economies tend to destroy old, antiquated things to shift those profits and opportunities over to somebody else. The problem is that when everything has to be tested against the categorical imperative of stability, right, as we were talking about before, stability, stability, stability. If that is the only mantra that leaders put in first place, then you can't really disrupt. These technologies aren't allowed off the leash. And so companies invest a lot in having these kinds of information tools, but they can't really use them to knock out the competition if the competition is government related, or local officials don't want to see a company put out of business and this sort of thing. So it sort of strangles the potential for productivity growth that was the wellspring, really, of China's tremendous performance the past 40 years, but has dried up, as Kevin was discussing, since 2015.
Kevin, would you like to add your thoughts? I feel like we have lost Kevin at the moment. Let's continue this discussion. Tom, what are your thoughts to what Dan was saying in terms of technological advancements and where China is going?
I take a slightly more optimistic view. And the reason for that is that where I see the state playing an expanded role in China, it's in old line industries. We mentioned the supply side reform agenda, which was another one of Liu He's big initiatives. And the supply side reform agenda was really important, and it expanded the role of the state, but it expanded the role of the state in sectors like steel and coal, which are part of China's past, not part of China's future. And when I look at the industries of the future, I see companies like Alibaba and Tencent, which are private companies, and I see them as having technologies which, as Dan mentions, are potentially having a disruptive effect across China's economy. I'll give you one example of how that's already having a sort of a positive impact. So a big concern in China historically has been the state banks. They don't care about small businesses. They don't care about private businesses. And so the private businesses are starved of capital. Now, because Tencent and Alibaba have these payment networks and have these kind of nascent financial capacity, and because they have quite a lot of data on businesses and they can see who's making money and who isn't, they can make smart decisions about which small businesses should get credit and which small businesses shouldn't get credit. And we actually saw that in a small way in the COVID-19 crisis. The big banks went into action to lend to the Bao Steels and the big state-owned enterprises. Alibaba extended some credit to some small businesses using its payment system and its nascent financial capacities. So there's certainly a lot of concerns. I certainly take the big macro point that Dan is making, that there's an obsession with stability and that stifles efficiency. But I think there are also some reasons for optimism.
Right, Kevin, it's good to have you back. We're almost done with our time today. Give us your take on today's conversation and perhaps what Tom mentioned right now on stifling competition in China as well.
Yeah, it's a good place to draw our conversation to a conclusion. I'm sorry about the technological glitch before. I'm not quite sure what happened. This conversation we're having now about fintech and financial technology innovation, where China actually is a global leader. It's a global leader, not just before firms like Alibaba and Tencent and others in the field, but because of the sheer scale of the market that they've been able to experiment with, and a capacity rapidly to innovate. Secondly, they've been able to grow so rapidly because, as far as the digital economy is concerned, they have had very few pre-existing state-owned competitors within the Chinese economic system capable of or predisposed towards making life difficult for them, which has happened in so many other sectors of the Chinese economy, where threatened SOEs seek to leverage the state to sustain those SOEs' market share against private sector competitors. So those in this cutting-edge fintech world, by and large, have had a market to themselves, where the leading state-owned banks have looked over their shoulder, often grumpily, and said, nah, but have allowed this to unfold. But thirdly, and I finish on this point, it is a Marxist-Leninist state. And the central dilemma of Chinese economic policies since the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in 1978 through to the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee in 2013, which delivered the 60-paragraph reform document which you spoke about before, through to the 19th Party Congress of Xi Jinping in 2017, through to the most recent National People's Congress in Beijing. If we were to use Tom's delightful phrase before, not phrase, but it pre-existed him, of course, but approach of word clouding all those documents. When you look at all these central policy directives and political decisions by the Chinese system, it is a permanent and continuing debate about the role of the state and the party, the state and the market, the private sector and SOEs, and all the sub-debates associated with that. And if I can generalize, by and large, between 78 and 2013, essentially it was a proposition of putting most of those problems behind you. That is, putting most of the party, state, ideology questions behind you as China sought to just grow the economy. But starting from the Xi Jinping era, that political economy balance has changed. And if you, without boring you with complex Marxist ideology, there are core elements of the 19th Party Congress document which go to the nature of that ideological change. And it's been reflected in concrete directions of economic policy as well. But the key thing is this: can this Marxist-Leninist party continue to happily coexist with a private sector which gets infinitely bigger than the state sector and infinitely bigger than the party itself? And that is the central tension that we see at play now, because of the tensions between the central contradiction, to use the Chinese Marxist-Leninist term, is between party control and market dynamism, for which fintech is the new frontier. If they let fintech go, then let me tell you, the Chinese economy will power ahead. But the Marxists will be concerned that they'll become an afterthought within the political system.
An eternal tension there, balancing in the Chinese economy. Kevin, thank you very much. It was a great insights, a great way to finalize this panel. Thank you to both Tom and Dan as well. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person next time. And thank you to our audience across Asia and here in the United States as well. It was a great conversation.
Thanks for taking us through this, Shery. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Shery. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Dan.